Hey folks, welcome back to Roaster School. We're here in Minneapolis, Minnesota at the Mill City Roasters campus. My name's Eliza and we're here with my good friend and fellow roaster in the world, Joe Morocco.
What's up?
And we're gonna be talking about different sized roasters and different charges in the same size drum today.
That's right. We're different sized roasters.
We are, this is true. And we definitely have backgrounds roasting on different size roasters.
This is very true.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to hopefully illuminate what it looks like to take a small batch and a large batch into the same drum, or to use different sized drums for their capacity of coffee, and talk about some correlations between the two. This was Eliza's idea, primarily because you get a lot of calls about this, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, and I've had to do it. I've had some personal experience with it. Yeah, roasting for competition and such, so.
Yeah, it's a big challenge.
Yeah.
And when you're starting out with a small machine, generally you're starting out with the hope and goal that you're going to eventually size that machine up. And so then once you've got a business underway, it's very important for you to kind of seamlessly move from that smaller machine to a larger machine and not waste a whole bunch of time. So hopefully we'll get you to at least a little bit of that ability within this conversation today.
Yeah.
How should we get started?
Oh, that is such a good question. Well, let's talk about replicating the same roast in a different size drum.
I like it.
Yeah.
Earlier we were talking about thermal mass and making correlations about thermal mass, and one of the illustrations that one of the guys here at Mill City, who is working the boards right now, Christian, came up with is talking about penguins, and how penguins, when it's really, really cold outside, you'll see all of these penguins grouped together and they hold their thermal mass together, because the more actual mass you have that holds onto energy, the harder it is for the cold to take that thermal mass away. It's kind of flipped in a roaster, where if you have a big roaster that has a lot of thermal energy or is holding on to a lot of high temperature and a lot of metal, then if you have a large batch of coffee, that large batch can steal that energy away, whereas a small batch is not going to cool that roaster down quite as much. However, when you look at it that way, that means that the small batch is actually able to get hotter faster with the same amount of energy that's stored in the drum, whereas a larger batch gets hotter more slowly, and it takes more input of energy to keep that drum energized in order to keep that flow of energy into that larger mass of coffee. So in the event that you have, we're just going to talk hypotheticals here. Let's say you have a drum that is, what is this drum?
This is a 20K.
20 kilo. Whoa, it's a big one. Let's say you have a 20 kilo drum and you're charging at 20% capacity. So 20% capacity on this guy would be about 16 kilo, which on a Mill City you can definitely go the full 20%. Most drums out there you're looking at 80% capacity for a full drum. So let's just say full capacity at 16 kilos of coffee. And you bring the thermal energy up in this machine all the way to, hypothetically, let's just say 400 degrees Fahrenheit to charge your coffee. You're going to see that 400 degree Fahrenheit drop once you charge the coffee into the drum relatively quickly, because that energy is going to be absorbed by that 16 kilos of coffee. That turnaround then is going to be a little bit sharp, and you're going to want to hit it with a lot of gas in order to move that coffee up in temperature from room temperature to whatever your roasted temperature is and the amount of time that you want to roast it in. If you take the same charged drum and you take the same amount of thermal energy and you put 50% capacity, so only 10 kilos of coffee in, what you'll see is that 10 kilos of coffee is not going to drop as fast. You're going to shallow out your turnaround, and what that means is your coffee is heating much more quickly. So making an adjustment for that needs to be a decision that you've already made prior to putting the coffee into the roaster. Now, on a machine like this, you have a lot of options to approach that coffee with. You have gas, you have the charge temperature of the drum, you have drum speed control, you have air speed control, all of these things. What we want to encourage you to do is focus on just one or two of these. I like to think about them as primary inputs and secondary inputs. Your primary inputs on this are going to be the temperature of your drum and the amount of fuel that you're using. Your secondary inputs are going to be the speed of air or the amount of airflow that you use and the drum speed itself. So what I would recommend you do if you're normally charging at a full capacity on a drum is set up an experiment with a drum or with a charge batch size that is much smaller than the one that you're used to using. So if you're used to going at 80%, set up your experiment for 50% or maybe even 40%, which a lot of drums I would not recommend going below 50%, but if you have a lot more control, you can go below 50%. So then set up those two experiments, use your full capacity as your control, and roast that control, cup that control, and have that cupping result be the standard that you're trying to meet with your smaller batch size. So then when you go with your smaller batch size, set up a parameter to where you're only using those primary controls, your drop temperature, your charge temperature, and your gas settings, okay? So what I would recommend is a lower charge temperature and then hit it with less gas because you're not gonna need quite as much energy to move that coffee along. See what you have to do with just using gas and that charge temperature to match that new 50% batch size to your 80% batch size. Once you get those two matched up in cupping, or at least very close, then you know exactly what the differential between the 80% and the 50% is, and you can go back to the drawing board on a 60% batch, a 70% batch, because now you know a whole lot more. That's called triangulation. So you use the first setting, the second setting, and then your third setting is much easier to figure out. Any thoughts on that?
No, I think that was pretty clear.
Okay, cool. So then when we talk about those secondary settings, drum speed and air control, I would go back to the drawing board on those once you have that smaller batch similar to that first batch, to your 80% batch or your full batch, and just use that in a way to nuance control that smaller batch that you have. If you're just banging your head against the wall using only gas and charge temperature and you still can't match the flavor profile of the full batch size, then that's when I would start leaning into air and then finally leaning into drum speed. And on those, I would make a large variance away from what you're doing on your larger batch. Because if you only make a small adjustment, you're probably going to go through a whole bunch of roasts before you figure out how that adjustment messes with the coffee. So for instance, if you're using drum speed and your drum control is set at 70, where your drum is speeding, at a pretty fast clip, I would move that way down to like 50 or even 40 and see what does this do to change how my coffee's heating and how my coffee eventually is going to taste. Taste the two, is it an improvement? Does it totally dismantle the coffee? Did it totally mess with all of my other settings? Then split that difference in half on the next one. If it makes an improvement, then you know that you've done what needed to be done. And if it doesn't, you know that you can go backward from there and save a lot of time.
Yeah, drum speed is a tricky one because if you think about what's actually happening to the mass of coffee in the drum, you can impose more air by ramping up that drum speed. So then you're messing with multiple variables, which I always caution people against.
Yeah, and to be quite honest and open with you, I still don't feel like I understand drum speed enough to really prescribe to you how to go about adjusting drum speed for different size batches. What I do know is that we've done some experimentation on the 500 gram and done 100 gram batches in it and matched those in a sample batch style, and we've done that by actually speeding up the drum for a smaller batch, which is kind of contrary to what my hypothesis would have been. And I don't know if that's going to be the same thing on a large drum or not. We just need a lot more data. So as you're getting those data points and you're trying different batch sizes in your roaster with different drum speeds, keep us in the loop because we'd love to collect that data and see if we can be more prescriptive in how we go about this. But for now, I would focus on what we do know, and that's thermal energy. Thermal energy, that's redundant. Thermal mass. And that is controlled with your gas setting primarily. So how much flame are you adding to that piece of equipment, and how is the piece of equipment imparting that into the coffee? So controlling your gas is going to be the biggest control that you have. Then you can use that air kind of as a brake or as a
conductor,
yeah,
if you will.
yeah, convector.
As it were, yes, technically.
Speeding that up or slowing that process down. Yeah. Sound good? So then whenever it comes to, I guess, the bigger of the two questions, which is taking coffee from a small drum and roasting it in a large drum and trying to match those two things, this can be a pretty complicated question.
Yeah, it can be. And I get so stuck on probes and how they're reading temperature, especially when changing from one size to the other. The last job I was at, where I was roasting all the time, where it wasn't just fun roasting like it is here, I was roasting my samples and profiling on a 500 gram and then moving up to a 6 kilo.
Okay.
And I found that they had very, very different probe readings, and I could charge my 500 gram drum and it would be super, super, super hot, but the probe would only be reading 400 or so, and I would have to charge the drum to like 350 so that my roast didn't just get away from me.
Yep.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah, if you think about a drum as being an individual, every individual drum is going to be very different. And even though you may have the same size probe on a different drum, it's still going to read very different because the thermal mass that that drum holds is going to be different from one drum to another. Take, for instance, this 20 kilo. This is a lot of metal sitting here. So the amount of BTUs that it takes to heat this metal up to anything meaningful,
It's significant.
in roasting is going to be a whole lot. So you have a whole lot more flame. You also have the burners on this are going to allow for a lot more flame per burner. So put all of that together, your controls are probably going to be a little bit different than they will on a smaller machine. If you're also sizing up from one brand of machine to another brand of machine, that's going to be a totally different ball game, especially if you're going, like, for instance, today I was speaking to somebody who has been roasting on a Sonofresco or like an air machine, and then they're moving over to a mill sitting machine, and they're just totally, wondering, how am I going to switch from this one to the other? How can I keep my profile similar? If your machine types are so widely varied, it may be the case that the ability for a machine like this to achieve a very high quality in roast compared to the older machine, like, for instance, I spoke to somebody today also that was roasting on a Baymore, and they're moving to a professional machine. That Baymore, you can probably get a similar roast on a machine like this that you do from the Baymore, but that Baymore never has the ability to achieve what this machine has. So if you're just looking for consistency when you're moving from one machine to another, you may be missing out on a lot of opportunity for quality. So I would recommend, first and foremost, before you think about just simply matching consistency, that you think about where can you achieve quality on the new machine. It's really important to think about a new machine as a new machine, as something that you need to learn. However, I do think that there is wisdom in matching still, just like we were talking about with batch sizing up. So if you can take one coffee in the machine that you're used to, roast that coffee, keep that as your control, and then on your new machine, try to match that new or that old roast that you had on the old machine. If you can do that, then that means that you're learning how to control your new roaster.
So what you're saying when you say control it in the same way, you mean hitting those events like going from green to yellow in the same amount of time and hitting first crack at the same time?
That is one way that you could start the ball rolling and then see whether the two taste the same, if you can do that. But what I mean by control is more of like that scientific terminology of having one thing that's consistent and the same that you're not going to change. So that would be the roast that you would do on the old machine. Whereas the new machine roast, that's what you're trying to bend to taste like the old machine's roast.
Got it.
So by doing that, you have to learn how to control your new machine because you're
Definitely.
forcing the coffee in a certain direction. And that may take some trial and error. So again, starting with what Eliza is saying, trying to match those event points, see if that tastes the same, is a great place to start. If your coffee tastes over roasted or under roasted compared to your control, then I would start at the end of that roast and think yourself backward from that point. Think about the end of that roast. That's probably what gave you your over or under roast flavor. So controlling whatever you can at that point. Well, if it was moving too fast at the end of your roast, or it tastes like it was moving too fast, then backing that up and saying, okay, what was my gas setting before that? And thinking once again about those primary settings on your machine, your gas and the actual temperature of your machine is going to be a great place to start. Once you get started there, then you can start working your way backward to all of the other secondary controls that you have in the new machine.
You make a really good point in that your drop temp, or when you drop your coffee, is the most important event in your roast, and it's the event that's not as trackable as seeing the physical color change from green to yellow, hearing first crack.
That's right.
Like those are,
Yeah, let's switch over here to the drawing board. I'll show you guys something that we visited before. So as you think about your roast, time over temp, remember that the amount of change that you have in that roast is going to increase dramatically as you go through the roasting process. So if you can focus first on making changes in this later section of your roast, in dialing this section in, then this section is not going to be nearly as important as this section. This section is important because everything that's happening, in the first part of your roast, everything that's happening here is setting up the next part, which sets up the last part. So these are stages that do affect each other, but in these stages, this section is the most important section for making your coffee a certain flavor. This section is secondary to that, and then your first section is the least important. Okay, so keep that in mind as you're moving from one machine to the other. So, in other words, if on one machine you see your coffee do this and take a really sharp turn, and you know when it takes that really sharp turn that the roast that you're trying to go for is more of a drawn out roast, you know that that really sharp turn is probably going to result in you finishing that first roast a little early. That's okay, as long as, like, let's say you hit yellow at 5 minutes on the first roast and hit yellow at 6 minutes on the second roast. As long as your distance between here and here is similar, and your distance between here and here is similar, you're probably going to come up with a very similar roast at the end of the day. As long as your distance between yellow and first crack and end of roast are similar, you're probably going to be pretty tight. Does that make sense?
I would say so.
Cool. Do we have any questions from our audience? I don't see any questions at this point. Do you have any more questions or thoughts on this?
Not on this particular topic.
Okay, cool. Well, let me get rid of that and see if you have any questions
Sweet.
on any other particular topics.
Well, so we were talking about those primary variables to mess with. Let's talk about charge temperature for a second.
Great. I love it.
Yeah, because that's such an important thing that I think sometimes gets overlooked. Not that it gets overlooked, but it's we have a tendency as roasters to get comfortable using a certain charge temperature, just batch over batch, and manipulating charge temperature for both switching batch sizes, but also over the course of the day, your charge temp might have to change.
That's true. So if you think about charge temp is the thermal mass that your drum has kind of in a rough estimate through
Well,
the
it's
way
like-
that your probe looks
Yeah,
at it.
exactly. The lens of the probe is so confusing.
It's true. So if you have one drum that's at 400 degrees on your probe, another drum that's at 380 degrees on your probe, and these drums are the exact same drum, it could be the case that they each have the same amount of thermal mass, but the probes could be in a different place. One might have airflow moving over the probe a little bit more, a little bit faster than another. There are other variables involved. What's really important is that for your drum, you know how your charge temps are affecting your coffee. But just in general terms, your charge temp is the energy that's stored in that drum. Okay, so if you think about the energy stored as being thermal mass, think about a drum. The metal of the drum is kind of like a beaker, okay? And the amount of temperature in that beaker is the mass of energy that it has. So if this is 200 and this is 400, then the mass of this right here is 200 degrees. So you know that the mass here being 400 degrees, it, when poured onto coffee, is going to saturate that coffee with a lot more thermal energy, and so change this coffee a whole lot more, right? So it's going to heat it up much, much more quickly, twice as fast potentially, if these were, correlating temperatures in that way. So if you think about it that way, as energy being some kind of physical thing, then you can think about how you're enforcing that upon the coffee, or thrusting the energy into the coffee itself. If you have it doesn't matter what your probe says, though. So if I have a probe that just happens to read this as 380, it doesn't matter what the probe is reading. What matters is I actually have the thermal energy such that it affects the coffee in the same way as another probe would read 400. So that's where trial and error kind of comes into play, is we can't tell you exactly what your probe on your machine is going to read, and we can't tell you exactly what your charge temperature needs to be for a certain batch size for a certain coffee.
But that's also why those events and watching those can be a really great tool.
Precisely. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Because also the other big variable here is this coffee. You have different coffees that have different densities. Density itself is going to affect how quickly the coffee absorbs energy. So for instance, if I have a metal ball that I drop into a hot roaster versus
a ball of feathers. Yeah, there you go. Same thing.
that metal ball is going to pull energy into the core of itself much more quickly than the cotton ball is going to pull energy into itself. Now, they may eventually get to the same temperature, so they both may have the ability to hold the same thermal mass, but the speed at which one has the ability to absorb that thermal mass is going to be different.
So I do think we have a question now.
Okay, great.
It is a little off of what you're already talking about, but how does the beam density affect the charge temp that you choose?
Oh, that's perfect.
So how does the beam density affect the charge temperature we use? This is a conversation we've talked a lot about in our density recording, so I recommend that you go back to that. So if you have a coffee seed that's very, very dense, then we know that it's going to pull this energy into itself much more quickly, right?
It's got more to conduct with.
That's right. So then it can roast much more quickly. In that roast, we know that since this is an organic piece of matter, that the roast on the part where it's absorbing the quickest and the most is going to be the outside layer. And so that outside layer is going to start roasting at a different rate than your internal layer. So we want to force Mother Nature the opposite direction that it wants to go, and generally start with a lower charge temp for a higher density bean so that we can slow that thermal exchange down. Because that coffee wants to absorb energy so quickly, we want to slow it down so that it doesn't over roast the outside and under roast the inside. Whereas conversely, for a low density coffee that absorbs energy much more slowly, we want to push that energy into the coffee. So we want to raise the charge temperature of that drum so that we can force that energy into the coffee much more quickly.
So I don't think it's fair to talk about this density though without addressing density and how it correlates to screen size.
Very, very true. So if I have one seed that's small and one seed that's large, and these seeds have the same amount of density, meaning that from the outside to the core of the coffee, energy will travel at the same speed. Well, obviously, if energy travels at the same speed here as it does here, here it will reach the core much more quickly because the bean is much smaller. So even though this bean is very high density, it might be very small in size. So I want to treat this like a higher or like a larger seed that's lower density, because I know that it's going to absorb energy not only at a fast pace, but also get it from the outside to the inside much more quickly. So I probably can raise that temperature a little bit because I know that from the inside to the outside, it's going to be roasting at a much more similar.
Yeah, it's just more even throughout because it's
Yes.
little baby. Yeah, so for those of you roasting pea berries out there, keep that in mind.
Yeah, and those pea berries, they like to pop out like popcorn too, if you hit them too hard and too fast. So you want to kind of treat them special. Another thing to think about here that Eliza and I were talking about earlier is, let's say you're doing, like I've talked about in the past, pre-roast blending, okay? So this goes back to that.
That penguin principle.
Exactly. So let me flip this a little bit.
Whoop.
Thank you.
Certainly.
Our board is on wheels, which keeps it interesting, which is not bored. Okay, so let's say you have Papa Penguin, Mama Penguin, okay, and then you have little baby penguin here between the two. Aren't those great penguins? So what a lot of roasters think when they're roasting a coffee that is a pre-roast blend and that has small beans and large beans in it is that this small bean, what's going to happen to it? It's going to get super hot, right? They think that it's going to just absorb a lot of energy really quickly. But that's not necessarily the case, because even though this small little guy here has the ability to absorb energy more quickly, take on that energy, it also has the ability to share that energy more quickly to the beans around it. So if Mama or Papa Penguin is colder than the little baby, they're going to absorb that energy. And the thermal mass between all of the penguins together is going to mitigate any one penguin from being much hotter than the other. So in other words, if all of these penguins are 400 degrees...
Which, that's a really hot penguin right there.
Yeah.
Whew.
Our coffee seed. This little guy is not going to have the ability to jump up to 450 because it's going to put its energy back into one of these other larger seeds. And the way that thermal energy works is that it moves from high to low. So anything lower temperature is pulling energy away from anything higher temperature. Now, in the event that this little guy gets separated from the flock, obviously it's going to heat up much more quickly, okay? But we want to think about it as being thermal mass all together. So they're sharing energy between themselves.
I think you also, though, just brought up a really interesting argument for if you're roasting a smaller batch in a larger drum, why not to ramp up your drum speed too much, because that actually separates out the pack a little bit.
It can. If your drum speed goes so fast that you're centrifuging your coffee to where your coffee is really like
on the
pulled
outsides,
up on the edges,
yeah.
that can be a major issue. Or if it's just flinging beans everywhere, then you're not
Also.
really controlling your coffee very much. If your drum speed, or if your batch size is so small that your probe is not buried in the bean mass, this is another issue because the probe is not giving you a proper reading. It's reading more of the energy in the space, and all of a sudden you're just kind of roasting in the dark. You still can do that because you can roast by sight and smell, and measure those major milestones, over time. But we don't really recommend that too much.
Cool.
Cool. Any other questions?
Sweet.
It's a good question.
Definitely.
All right. Well, I think that kind of covers our topic for today. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us. What is your email?
Just Eliza at millcityroasters.com.
Yeah, and I'm Joe at cafeimports.com. And we'll be back next month with another edition. We're considering a few different options for our next month's installation. But if you have any other questions that you want to run by us, your questions are what lead us to these episodes. So please send your questions our way, and we're happy to be here. Don't forget to check out Mill City's Instagram account. Sign up to get those.
Yeah, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel on YouTube. The link will be below.
That's right. We'll
Thanks,
see you
guys.
next month. Thank you. Bye.